What are the big questions this generation is asking? And those of us who care about this generation, parents, youth workers, mentors, coaches, teachers, you name it, how do we help them answer these questions in a helpful biblical way? Well, we have a guest with us today who I think is one of the most qualified and thoughtful people to address this. She has been in youth ministry over 3 decades and has a great new book out that's releasing within about a week or two. It's called 3 Big Questions that change every teenager. And Dr. Kara Powell has been willing to come on early and kind of give us a glimpse of what these questions are. So thanks so much for coming on.
Oh, thanks, Sean. It's an honor to be with you and your listeners. Although I feel bad because my background doesn't totally coordinate with what I'm wearing like yours does. Your red shirt and your red background. You look just awesome. So I'll work on that for next time.
Well, no worries about that. It's coming through clear, and I'm a big Biola guy, so the red is just shining through.
Perfect.
Now, you've got a line in this book that I have already been quoting, even though I just read it. I love this line. You said, every teenager is a walking bundle of questions. Yeah. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, my co-author and friend, Brad Griffin, and I, we both have 3 kids who are all teenagers or older. So we're certainly living with teenagers, and in our extensive youth ministry experience, like kids are wonderfully wondering all sorts of things about themselves and our world, especially when that, say, middle schooler switches from only being able to think concretely to being able to think more abstractly. That expands a whole new horizon of questions for that young person. So part of what delights me about spending time with young people is the way they're curious, they're wondering. And for us as adults, when they feel safe with us, what a gift it is for them to share their questions with us, whether it's something as simple as, why is there traffic? If everybody just drove faster, couldn't we all get to the destination more quickly? To something that's more deep or existential about themselves or suffering in the world, why God would allow certain things, et cetera. So part of what I love about young people is their curiosity, their openness to questions. And like I said, when we are a safe place, the way that young people will give us the gift of those questions to discuss with them.
Well, kids have always had questions because they're human, and part of being human, we're made in God's image and we want to understand the world we're placed in. But right. Some of the questions being asked today are unique to the cultural moment that this generation is raising in. And we're going to get to some of those specific questions. And those of you who join us, we're going to walk through some very practical things that we can do to help this generation. But first, something else jumped out to me from your book, Carrie. You said, we'll never activate this generation if we don't understand their questions. And first off, there's an assumption. Some people are very pessimistic about this generation. You seem to think we can activate this generation. So talk about that, but also why it's important to start with understanding their questions.
Yeah. Well, I think there's just an increased awareness of the needs of the world that this generation experiences, partly because of their technology, their cell phone. They are so much more aware of what's going on in the world than you and I were, Sean, when we were teenagers. They understand, I shouldn't say they understand, but they certainly are aware of what's going on in the world. In fact, last year in 2020, in the midst of all the racial unrest and pursuit of racial justice, my kids, home a lot because of the pandemic,
Sure.
They were really dialed in to what was going on. And so, usually the first question at dinner I would ask during those few months in May, June, July was, what'd you see on social media today about race? And they would invariably know more than I knew, see more than I had seen. And so that's a real gift that this generation gives to all of us, is their understanding of the needs of the world. And I think especially when they have the right adult support, which is an invitation to all of us as adults to make sure we support them, when we can figure out how a young person's sense of justice, their passion for service, when we can figure out how that can align or connect with their gifts, their abilities, their time schedule, then, young people can do amazing things. And I think we saw this during the pandemic. One of the fascinating shifts I saw many astute churches make is they realized, hey, for the first time in a few decades, teenagers have more time. They had more
Yes.
time during the pandemic. Like, every youth leader I know over the last few decades has said, oh, kids are so busy, teenagers are so busy. And they finally weren't so busy during the pandemic. And so creative churches activated young people, whether it was baking bread for people in need or whether it was
Yeah.
delivering groceries or simply reaching out to other kids in the church who had maybe drifted and inviting them to join a Zoom meeting that might be less intimidating than showing up at a church building or a Bible study. So this was one of the amazing things that we saw during the pandemic is how young people were, as they're changed by Christ, how they were changing the world around them.
Kara, one of the things I've always appreciated about your writings is that it's research based. It's not just opinion, but you do studies. And this book is based on a landmark study that we're going to get into in detail. And by the way, when we come to the end, those of you watching, we've got a free signed copy of my book, so the next generation will know for the best question. So we will get there towards the end.
Woo!
Exactly.
Great.
Now, you've been doing this for a while. Not as long as my dad has been in youth ministry, but 3 decades is impressive. I'm curious from where you're at, how have the kinds of questions changed and or even stayed the same in the time that you've been working with students?
Yeah. Well, I think I'd answer that question by zeroing in on some of the unique adjectives that we think describe this generation. Because, to your point, Sean, there are some ways that young people, cohort across cohort tend to be pretty similar, but there are some ways that each generation, each slice of a cohort is a little bit different. And so based on research largely we did in reviewing other people's research, we landed on 3 adjectives that we think describe this generation in a unique way. First off, they are an anxious generation. And so, we shouldn't go much further in talking about this generation before we talk about mental health struggles.
Yeah.
And this generation is struggling with anxiety, suicide, depression at higher rates than at least the last several generations. It was high. Those were high even before the pandemic. Many of those rates have doubled or even tripled during the pandemic because of the social isolation. So, this generation is an anxious generation. So a lot of their questions have to do with the pressure that they feel, how they handle all of that, how they handle all the expectations that they're navigating. Sometimes their own expectations are the greatest pressure that they place upon themselves. So questions related to anxiety. The second word that we use to describe this generation is they're an adaptive generation. They are creative. And this goes back to what you asked about this generation being activated. I mean, this generation is resilient, whether it's because of adult support or because of the lack of adult support. This generation has some amazing grit, to quote researcher Angela Duckworth, in terms of these resilience muscles that cause them to keep persevering. So a lot of the questions have to do with that. Like, how do I persevere when life is tough? How do I help other people persevere? So they're anxious, they're adaptive, and then they're diverse. We crossed a line in 2020 in the midst of everything else that happened in 2020. We crossed a line in census data for those under 18. So now across the US, those under 18, we are 50% are young people of color and 50% are young people who are white. So, listeners and viewers, their communities might be skew one way or the other, but when you look at the US as a whole, young people are our most diverse generation. If you look at the US population, all ages were about 2/3 white, 1/3 people of color. So you can see those under 18 are more skewed toward people of color. And so, there's a lot of new questions related to that. How do I relate to people who are different than me? How do I love people who are different than me? How do I move past my own biases or limited background because of my social location? When it comes to diversity, we also need to mention gender identity. For a lot of young people, that's a very, very pressing question. And so they're wondering about that. either in themselves or certainly in what they're seeing in their peers. So those are just some of the facets of diversity that bring new questions to young people. So anxious, adaptive,
Yeah.
and diverse are the three adjectives we land on for this generation, what's called Gen Z.
Those are really good. I've done a ton of research on this data, and that lines up with the way when I often simplify, of course,
Yeah.
digital natives is at the heart
Yep.
of all three of these.
Totally.
But in diversity, you're right. Whatever we call the generation after Gen Z will be the first majority non-white generation,
Yep.
which is fascinating. And even
Yep.
those that don't live in diverse communities still get diversity through social media, and it
Yep.
affects the way this generation sees the world. Now, these are the kinds of questions and issues you describe in the book that kids are walking around just asking and wrestling with. But you say they're not service questions, but there's deeper questions undergirding them.
Yeah.
Through this data and study that you did, what emerged as the three deeper questions that young people are really trying to answer in their lives?
Yeah. So we had the honor in our research, Sean, of not only surveying over 2,000 teenagers, but we did deep dive interviews with 27 teenagers from around the country, who we spent 4 to 6 hours with each of them, really trying to understand them. Not in one sitting; that would be way too much for them and for us. Let me be clear: we usually did 3 interviews with each of them, and each interview asked different questions, got a little bit deeper, peeled back the layers, and just what a huge blessing it was to spend time with these young people. And speaking of diversity, we actually skewed the sample on purpose toward young people of color. So of the 27 kids that we interviewed, teenagers we interviewed, 7 were young people who are white and 20 were young people of color, because we wanted to be extra. We wanted to be extra attentive to some of those challenges and opportunities for young people from immigrant families, young people from multiracial families, et cetera. So in the midst of spending all these hours with young people, we've landed on 3 questions that, on the surface, a young person might be asking about homework or asking about college or asking about drugs and alcohol, whatever it might be. But we think I don't want to say always, because researchers don't say always, but almost always, I'll qualify that a bit, deeper questions that really fuel these other questions. And so those 3 questions are identity, who am I? Belonging, where do I fit? And purpose, what difference can I make? So identity, belonging, and purpose. Now, you might be listening to those questions and thinking, gosh, I struggle with those too. I'm dealing with those questions too. And that's absolutely right. These are questions that they're not just young people questions, they're people questions. I will say in my own life, if I feel heat about an issue, if I find myself kind of getting emotional about something positively or negatively, it's normally related to my own quest for identity, belonging, and purpose. So I think we all, including those of us over 30, are looking for identity, belonging, and purpose. It's just that for those of us who are older, it's more at a low simmer. And for our young people, it's more at a rolling boil. Those questions are just much more intense, prevalent, and provocative in their lives.
Kara, one of the things that I've also cited your research, going back to sticky faith, and you may have talked about this long before, is it came out that kids have these core questions about how do I fit into God's story? How do I know God loves me? But at the heart of it, you say, it's not doubt that distracts a kid's faith. So I want you to talk about doubt, but if you'll frame it in the way you do in this book, that you say many churches are not addressing the questions that kids are really asking. Now, you always do this in such a respectful place. You love the church. This is not like bag on the church at all. Yeah. This is like someone from within saying, we're not scratching where kids are itching, so to speak. Yeah. So what happens when in the church we don't really deal with the questions that kids are asking?
Sean, I'm so glad you asked that. And like you, I love the church. I think the church is the best hope for all generations, including our youngest generations. And I think the church is the best hope for this country, the United States, as well as any country. So I absolutely love the church. And that's why because I care so much about the church. I want to help all of us in the church be our best selves when it comes to loving and serving young people. And so a friend of mine had shared this quote, which we put in the book, from a young person she was interacting with. And the young person said, "I wish the church would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not asking." Wow is right. Like that. I mean, I think about that multiple times in a week. I wish the church would stop giving me answers to questions I'm not asking. And, if we can recalibrate and really empathize with what this anxious, adaptive, diverse generation is experiencing, and we can provide a safe place for their questions, even their questions about doubt. Wouldn't it be awesome if young people thought, I have some tough questions. I'm going to go to the local church to try to understand those questions. I don't know where the church would be listed on their sources to go if they want to process questions, but sadly, even church young people, it's often not in the top 2 or 3. And thank you for hearkening back to some of our previous research on doubt. When we looked at sticky faith or long-term faith in young people, we were pretty amazed that about 70% of youth group graduates say they had significant doubts about God. And that might cause any of us as parents, as leaders, as mentors, as pastors, as step parents, grandparents, whatever it might be, to kind of get nervous, like, oh my goodness, 7 out of 10 young people have these questions. Odds are good that any young person that we care about, there's a 70% chance that they have tough questions about God. But here's the surprising twist in our previous research, is that when young people had the opportunity to express and explore their questions, that was actually correlated with greater faith maturity. So put more simply, it's not doubt that is toxic to faith, it's silence that is toxic to faith. And what Brad and I and the whole Full Youth Institute team wants is that churches and families and Bible studies, that they can be greenhouses in which we can discuss some of these questions. And so, Sean, if I may, I'd love to help all of us, your listeners and viewers included, have a couple questions to keep in their hip pocket to try to get a little deeper. Okay, great.
Yep.
So these are some of my favorite questions to ask young people. First is, if you could ask God any question, what would it be?
Great.
If you could ask God any question, what would it be? I'll tell you, I know youth ministries who've offered that, like in a survey, or had kids be able to text in their answers to that. And like that then becomes a 3 to 6 week curriculum series for them, looking at those questions. So I'm more open-ended. If you could ask God any question, what would it be? For mentoring, parenting, closer relationships, 2 that I like, and in fact, I asked our 15-year-old, our youngest, these questions, just a couple of weeks ago. The 2 questions are, what do you now believe that you think I don't believe?
That's really interesting.
And then the flip side of that is, what do you no longer believe that you think I still do believe?
Wow.
So, these are 2 questions. What do you now believe that you think I don't believe? And what do you no longer believe that you think I believe? These are questions that, just lay the cards out on the table and say, we might not see eye to eye on everything related to faith, but we can talk about that. We can talk about areas where we disagree. We can listen. We can learn from each other. And, Sean, there's this paradox that we as adults feel about young people's faith. Like we want young people's faith to grow, but we don't want it to change. Like we get nervous when young people's faith changes. And so, what I want for families and for youth ministries and parachurch ministries is that are around the table, or around the, in the minivan, or around the kitchen island, whatever it might be, that we can have these conversations, and that we're making room. In fact, we are inviting our young people to share with us where they disagree with us. I would so much rather do that and be able to open that can of worms than have that can of worms fester and get, really toxic and corroded. So, and my goal when I talked to my 15-year-old about these two questions, she had a few things to say that she thought
Wow.
she now believed that I didn't. And my goal was not to convince her. I mean, I can't say that was totally absent. I do kind of think that I'm right on these particular issues, or I wouldn't believe it, right? I mean,
Of
so,
course.
but that's not my primary goal. My primary goal is not to change her mind. My primary goal is to listen to her so that she experiences the dignity and the honor of being a young person with opinions, and that we create the tenor in our relationship where we can keep agreeing and disagreeing with each other.
Now, Kara, this is really rich stuff, but I imagine there's some parents listening right now going, that sounds scary. Not sure I can do that. What encouragement would you give for parents to have the mindset to even open up those conversations?
Yeah. So, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Sean, because, you and I have done advanced training in scripture and theology. In fact, I've done 27 grades of school, but let me just say, I counted it up. I'm sure you're in the high 20s also, but I've done 27 grades of school, but still, like, my 15-year-old can stump me with her questions about God. So first off, let me just say that if as much as I love and believe in the apologetics work that you and others are doing, I mean, that's so important, so that our young people in all generations are equipped. I think to balance that, there's something about God that's not fully explainable. Like, if we could explain everything about God, then I think God just becomes kind of a cool guy, instead of a holy other God. So I welcome to the club, all parents, all leaders who feel like they're going to be stumped by their kids. So let me offer myself and you and your listeners and viewers kind of a placeholder statement. And I've used this with my own kids. I've used it with youth group kids. I know a lot of parents and leaders who've used it. And it's this phrase: I don't know, but. I don't know, but. So if a young person asks you a question or raises something and you're thinking, I don't know how to respond to that, you just say, boy, I don't totally know how to respond to that, but, and this is where you have a lot of options. But how about if you and I get together with our pastor, who I know is asking those same questions about science, and let's involve her in the dialogue too. Or, I don't know, but how about if you and I study scripture together? I'll read up on it, and then we can look at scripture together. You can read up on it. Let's go out for pizza next week and let's talk about it. Or, I don't know, but here's what I do know about God. And I've used this a lot. A lot of questions that teenagers have asked me that have stumped me have had to do with suffering, and it's hard to explain the role of suffering in the world. I can give some explanation, but I can't fully explain it. And so for me to say, boy, I don't know, but Romans 5, 3-4 has meant so much to me, where Paul writes that suffering leads to perseverance, character, and character, hope. So in the midst of suffering, that gives me a sense of how God's trying to use it and redeem it. So, I don't know, but let's involve another person in the conversation. Let's schedule a time, tomorrow, next week, whatever it might be. But you definitely want to look back to that conversation once you've had a chance to prepare. Look up wise people like you, Sean, who are equipping those of us who are parents and mentors to know how to have those conversations, or simply pointing to what you have experienced about God, your own experience, and how powerful that can be. So I don't know, but is a great keep it in your hip pocket default phrase that helps you continue the relationship and come back when you're a little bit better informed.
I love that, because it shows that you're okay living with questions. And I think if I was to guess, when you said it's not just doubt, but unexpressed doubt that hijacks a faith, it's not the intellectual side. It's this emotional, just kind of tension somebody's living with. And when they see somebody who's a leader and a parent who's like, I believe, but I have questions, and that's okay, that just gives huge permission. Totally. But second, it's also relational. Let's look this up together. Let me follow up with you. I
Yeah.
think that's awesome. One thing my dad did with us, which surprises a lot of people, is he just asked a question back. He'd be like, that's first thing I often do when I get a question is I'll say to my son, this week he asked me something. I'm like, such a good question. I love your questions, buddy. And the second I'll say, if you were going to answer this and you had to make a guess, what would your guess be?
That's good. That's really good.
And sometimes he's like, I don't know, Dad. That's why I asked
That's what I'm
you.
asking you. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Other times he would say, well,
Yeah.
here's what I think. And I just
Yeah.
ask questions. But what both of us are trying to do is not answer it too quickly,
It's
leave
good.
some level of mystery, engage that relationship. And sometimes I look back, I'm like, I could handle that better with my kid. But these are principles that we try to live out. And that's what you're doing in the book, these very
Yeah.
practical handles. You always do this. Like another thing that you say, Kara, is 3 words. Tell me more.
Yeah.
Why do you do that? And why are those 3 words so
Yeah.
powerful relationally with kids?
Yeah. Before we get to tell me more, I was just thinking something that I've actually probably used more with youth group kids than my own kids. But I'm being convicted here of using it more with my own kids. Is when they ask a question, ask, can you tell me a little bit why you're asking that question? Because usually there's a deeper story. It's something they saw on social media. It's something a friend asked them. It's something a teacher brought up. And, so to understand the full context, I think helps me really appreciate, like you said, it's often not just an intellectual question, but there's an emotional, relational dynamic to it that I absolutely want to understand also. So tell me more. My Fuller colleague, Steve Argue, he and his wife have used this statement. And in fact, at one point when they had teenagers at home, like they had a sign in either their kitchen or their family room that said, tell me more, because they just wanted to be a safe place for young people, especially their own kids and their kids' friends, to tell them a little bit more. And if you have tried to connect with a teenager, I'm guessing many of us have, and sometimes that kid will open up, but a lot of times, maybe even the majority of the time, it's not this amazing conversation. You ask them, how was school, how was church, how was volleyball practice, whatever it
Sure.
might be, and you get good, the normal. So, and then their eyes go to their phones, especially say if you're in the car or whatever it might be. And so tell me more is just a non-intimidating way to, again, take the conversation a little bit deeper. So, so how was school? It was pretty much normal. Well, tell me more about the most interesting thing that one of your teachers said at school today. Or tell me more about what you did for lunch and who you hung out with. Or tell me more about PE and, how's it going with softball or whatever it might be. So it just helps you kind of stretch things a little bit more, because often, that it's the second or the third question that you ask or that you nudge that really opens the door. Now, I will say, in fact, Josh, with DCLA was an event that Youth for Christ used to put on every 3 years.
Of course.
And evangelism training, I know you and your dad were involved. And there's one image from that I think is important in all conversations with young people. It was in the context of evangelism, but I think it's true for all conversations. They talked about like a fruit tree, let's say an orange tree. When you're picking that orange, you give a gentle tug. And if the orange is ripe, then it will come off in your hands. But if it's not ripe, you don't want to like shake the branch and try to get the orange to come down. And I think in my insecurities, and this might be interesting because this ties back to identity for me, and my insecurities as a parent or as a mentor and my desire to connect, I give a gentle tug, the kid maybe still isn't opening up, and then I try like even harder. And that usually doesn't go well. So I think there's something about testing it out. Is that young person open to sharing a little bit more? How do they respond to the first tell me more? But then we don't need to force it. Most of us are in these relationships for a marathon, not a sprint, and we can trust God to give us an opportunity tomorrow, next week, whatever it might be, where that gentle tug maybe does yield ripe fruit and a young person who's ready to talk.
Those of you who just joined us, we're here with Kara Powell, who is a youth ministry guru. I hope you're okay with that title. You've been doing
Yeah.
it 3 decades, a ton of research, just been
I think that just means I'm old,
like,
Sean. But yeah, okay, we could label it either way.
it's better than calling you a legend, because then that would be really old and just past your time.
That's true. That's
So
true.
we'll
That's true.
we'll stick with that compliment.
Very
But then in just a few minutes, we're going to come to your questions for Dr. Kara Powell related to her recent book, 3 Questions That Change Every Teenager. Research-based, but also very, very practical. Now, you mentioned a moment ago, kind of pulling that fruit off the tree. Sometimes we tug out of our own insecurities. I love your vulnerability in the book, where you talk about and you give a specific example of how we can lead or love from a place of deficit.
Yeah.
Talk about that, if you will.
Well, this gets pretty personal for me, Sean. So I think of those 3 questions, identity, belonging, and purpose, when we spent time interviewing these teenagers, we were trying to hear how they currently answer those questions and what's a Jesus-centered answer to those questions. And I think in many ways, that's what discipleship is. It's all of us walking, ideally in community, from our current understanding of our identity, belonging, and purpose to a Jesus-centered version of identity, belonging, and purpose. And I also think that most of us have one question that is a little bit more predominant. My husband, like when he hears a need in the world, he wants to get a hammer, get on an airplane, and go fix it. He's very purpose driven. My 18-year-old, she's just all about belonging, wants to be with people, wants to create a sense of belonging. For me, I lean more into identity, and that tends to be both the challenge and the opportunity for me to grow. And when we listen to young people's current answers, a lot of what young people feel currently when it comes to their identity is I'm not enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not popular enough. I'm not attractive enough. I'm not athletic enough. For young people of color who feel torn between multiple worlds, I'm not Latino enough. I'm not Black enough. These were all things that kids verbalized. Now, I'll hold it there to myself. Where I struggle with not feeling enough, it's not in the work, the ministry, the leadership side of me. It's totally in the parenting and in the wife side of me, where I feel like, Dave could have a better wife, my kids could have a better mom. And, this is where our research doesn't always help, because I study all these amazing parents, right? So I'm learning from these exemplary parents, basically, and leaders. And so I remember one day I did 3 parent interviews in a row. And, afterwards I'm like, oh my gosh, I stink as a parent. There's so much I've blown, which is true. But generally, I'm realizing when I am my worst parent, it's usually because I'm struggling with identity as a parent and not feeling like enough. So let me give you an example. Today's Tuesday. Saturday, our 15-year-old came to me and said, hey, Mom, would you mind taking me to the mall? And I said, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Who are you going to meet? And she said, I just want to go by myself and buy some clothes. And I said, well, how about if I come with you? Wanting to connect with my mom, with my 15-year-old, thinking, shopping is a great thing a great way to do that with some kids. And so I said, well, how about if I come with you? And she said, no, I think I just want to go by myself. And in my identity insecurity and not feeling like enough, I went right to the pit of my 15-year-old doesn't want to be with me. And here I am offering to take her shopping and she doesn't want to be with me. And I didn't handle it very well. I didn't get angry, but I said, well, I guess, if you're not going to go with me, I'd feel better if you went with friends. And so she ended up finding a few friends and they went to the mall and she bought a couple shirts and et cetera. But I knew I hadn't handled it very well. And I think she felt that too. So actually last night we went out for frozen yogurt as a family. And as we're driving home, I said to Jessica, I'm sorry. I feel like I totally blew it on Saturday when you wanted to go to the mall. And I'll be honest, the fact that you didn't want to go shopping with me made me feel like a bad mom. And so I was struggling with that. And she said, oh, no, Mom, it's not that at all. I like doing things by myself. And she's right. Her identity is I'm an independent person. And she is. She likes to walk to the park by herself. She'll ride a bike and get boba by herself. She'll take the dog for a walk by herself. As much as she loves people, she also loves doing things on her own and being that independent. And so, here Jessica's healthy, developmentally normal quest for identity bumped up against my identity insecurities. And so, I really wish I had handled it better on Saturday, but I think the second best thing is to apologize afterwards. And then it opened up a conversation. And Jessica, I wouldn't do this with a 5-year-old, but Jessica's 15. And I think it's fine for her to understand that sometimes I struggle with feeling like a bad mom. And I happened to when you said that. So anyway, that's just the last 3 days, Sean, of identity. But I think what I would boil it down to is a lot of times our teenagers' developmentally normal quest for identity, belonging, or purpose somehow triggers our own insecurities. And then we tend to not parent or mentor them from a place of healing and freedom, but more from a place of scarcity. And so we're not our best influencing at that point. So
thanks for being vulnerable. We had an issue with our daughter coming home. We're like, don't go, try to your room somewhere else and just get on with your phones. Come see us. We want to talk. We want to connect. Yeah. This is important. And she didn't. So right away I'm sitting there going, she's not listening. I'm not a good parent. Got to crack the whip. She wants her friends more than us. And then I go up there and I talk with her, and I could not have been more wrong about what was going on. Totally. So a deep breath. I'm like, you know what? I'm parenting for my own deficit and my own insecurity, just as you described. So if you and I write books on this and people assume we have it together, we don't, which means we all have insecurities. Now, kids often don't realize that, and I think when you grow up, you're supposed to have it all together. So that vulnerability just builds that relationship with our kids, I think, in a powerful way. So thanks for modeling and for sharing that. Now, there's a study in your book that really, it didn't surprise me, but I want you to talk about it because you asked kids, what does it mean to be a Christian in terms of belief, behavior, and relationship? And it's vital, and I think we miss this. Talk about what the research showed.
Yeah. Well, you foreshadowed it well, Sean. We were very curious how young people would define what it means to be a Christian, what it means to follow Jesus. And so we asked these 27 youth group kids, I need to say we usually got nominations from a youth pastor from around the country. We didn't ask them, hey, point us to your youth group superstar, the kid who's always there and goes on the mission trip every summer and all that. But we asked for, a more typical kid. But I think youth pastors tend to nominate, a kid they know is articulate, probably pretty involved, will say yes, et cetera. So while we didn't select for leadership, more spiritually mature kids, these kids definitely skewed that direction. Okay. So keep that in mind with what I'm going to say. These were kids who one would think they would have an accurate sense of what it means to follow Jesus. And so we listened to their answers. What does it mean to follow Jesus? What it means to be a Christian? And then we coded it in 3 categories. Behaviors. And this was where these young people were the strongest. Here's what I do and don't do as a Christian. So fairly strong on behaviors. Also, then we asked this question and saw that for a lot of them, it was belief. So, it's I believe in God, I believe in heaven, I believe Jesus was resurrected, et cetera. And then the third category was relationship. And I guess the good news is that of the 27 kids that we interviewed, about a third mentioned 2 out of 3 of those categories. Okay. Well, I'm not sure if that's good news or bad news. A third mentioned 2 out of 3 of those categories. Only 1 really mentioned all of them. Wow. And so, this is a limited sample of 27 kids, but I think it raises a question if these probably more mature than average youth group kids weren't seeing faith in a holistic way. They were seeing it, primarily about behaviors or maybe about beliefs, relationships, but not about the 3 together. Because, Sean, that's that's the faith of scriptures. I mean, it's certainly all three. I there's a lot of behaviors that are emphasized in scripture. There's a lot of do's and don'ts, and even in Paul's epistles, the last chapters of Paul's epistles is where he gets very prescriptive with a lot of commands.
That's right.
So I'm all for those behaviors. It's just that they need to be grounded in relationship, in belief. And so it's really the three coming together that make for the robust faith. And that's lacking in the young people that we interviewed.
That matches all the other data that I've done, that Christianity can be legalistic or moralistic or just belief-based, not tying those three together, which is scriptural relationship, and it's what we believe, and it's how we live, which comes out of what we believe. So that's really important for something that those of us who work with students need to think through what we're emphasizing and how we do it. Now, I've got just a few more questions for you, and then we're going to come to questions. I've seen a ton that have listed here. Recognize some familiar names who join us live stream, some new names and folks. If you've already stated a question, I missed it, in a minute, going to have you copy and paste it in the bottom. We will do our best to get through as many as we can, but let's get really practical with one. What you walk through in your book, again, I'll just show people watching because I really want to pick it up. 3 big questions that change every teenager is to try to take these questions on identity, belonging, and purpose and reframe them from the way that Jesus answers them rather than the answers they're getting in the world in which we live. Let's get specific with identity because everybody's talking about identity today. What would it take to help a young person see themselves in the way Jesus does rather than some of these cultural messages about identity?
Yeah. So as I already said, when we interviewed young people on identity, one of their 2 most common current answers was that they didn't feel like they're enough, smart enough, pretty enough, etc. The other current answer is their identity was really defined by external audiences. So, their parents wanted this, their extended family wanted that, friends wanted this, and et cetera. Pastors and small group leaders and Christian mentors wanted, something else perhaps. And so there's all these different theaters of action that a young person feels like they have to perform for and match those expectations, match the script. And so, as we reflected on what is it that we want young people to know, there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different answers to that question, but especially because not feeling enough was such a theme. And I think it is a theme with this generation of young people. We want young people to know that Jesus makes them enough. In fact, Jesus makes them more than enough. And, we talk about John 6 in the book, where a young person comes to Jesus with some loaves and some fish and, the cheapest bread, the smallest fish. And Jesus blesses it, feeds thousands, and then there are 12 basketfuls left over. That's an abundant God. And so, I mentioned I struggle with not feeling like I'm enough. I have a handful of prayers that I pray for myself every day, and that's one of them, that I would know that Jesus makes me more than enough, and that I would lean into that and live that out. So I'll just quickly foreshadow for belonging, we want young people to know that in the midst of unconditional acceptance, that there's conditional acceptance, there's unconditional acceptance with God's people. So the big word for identity is enough. The big Jesus word for belonging is with. And then lastly, for purpose, we want young people to know that their lives have meaning when they're part of God's story. So story is the big word. In the midst of a world that says you have meaning when you're rich or successful or get a certain degree or get a certain job or have this certain family. No. Ultimately, our lives have meaning when we're part of God's story. So enough, with, and story. Those are the 3 big narratives that we want all people to journey into.
One of the points that you make about students is they can only know what they ought to do when they understand first what story they're a part of.
Yeah.
And that's where the worldview comes in, because a worldview is a story about reality.
For sure.
And through relationships and asking pointed questions. And you really walk through in your book some very specific practical questions and give people permission to just hold up the book or make copies and just use it. Like, hey, I'm a dork, but that's okay. I really want to know, that's fine. It's really it's a study that's practical, which is what I appreciate about it. Not a lot of academics do that. as you
Oh,
know.
thank you. And yeah, and I will just say, I mean, the book has over 300 questions. And Sean, you've obviously read it very carefully, which I appreciate, because we do say, like, feel free to take the book with you. And in fact, use this podcast, use the book as an excuse to kind of interview a kid and be able to ask them these questions. I mean, there's times when we want to set it up more organically and all that. But,
Sure.
I've had some really powerful conversations with young people when I say, hey, I was reading something and I'm wondering if you and I could get together for 45 minutes and I could interview you and better understand. Make the
Love
young
it.
person the expert, and let them kind of inform you about their life and other young people. It's okay to make it structured and overt like that, as well as more subtle and organic. I think there's a place for both.
Good. That's awesome. Well, let's shift to some of these questions. Here's a thoughtful one from Tiffany, who I've seen in a number of live streams before. Thanks for joining us, Tiffany. She says, how do you encourage students to seek the answers to their questions while not promoting society's ideal of self-love, following one's heart, etc.?
Wow. Great question, Tiffany. Sean, how would you answer that question? No, I'm just kidding. That's my default. If I'm ever leading a discussion and I think, boy, that's a really good one, I need to think about that a while, I open it up to the group. So, yeah, you know what? This is the one of the themes in the book, and this is a mantra that I've tried to make in our own family, is that only Jesus satisfies. Only Jesus satisfies. And there are other things that, bring some degree of satisfaction short term, that grade, that making it into the play, that relationship, that boyfriend, girlfriend, etc. Like that brings some level of satisfaction, but it ultimately
Good.
lets us down. And so, I think helping young people think about and debriefing with them as after they've experienced a letdown, how something that they were counting on just didn't last, and then contrasting that with the Jesus who does last, the Jesus who does satisfy, etc. So, I think pulling at those threads. I think the other thing is young people remember stories. In fact, we did family church last night. We do it every week, and we were looking at Ephesians 4, speaking the truth in love. And so I shared a time. I shared a time when a friend had spoken the truth to me in a way that didn't feel loving, and how hard that was for me. And like our two teenage girls just got riveted on that. Like, well, who was it, Mom? And what did they say? And they were asking me all these questions, which I didn't answer. And I made clear, like, I'm not going to get into details. I just want you to know the difference. But what stood out is like that story really resonated with my girls. And as much as I want them to remember a lot of Ephesians 4 from our looking at it last night, because we're working through Ephesians, it's that story that's going to be one of the things they remember. So I think as we share our own stories of ways that Jesus has met all of our needs, as well as ways that other things that we thought were going to be meaningful, getting into that college, getting that car, getting that boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it might be, as we share that, as we expose our kids and teenagers in our church to other adults who can share those stories. So in addition to kind of pulling the threads of how Jesus satisfies versus other things, I'd also expose them to stories, your own and others, where you realize that.
I love that. Sounds like it's a lot of people in their life and a lot of conversations over time. It's not one conversation, taking opportunities that are there.
It's like one continual conversation. It's like a conversation that never ends. So, yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Here's one for you. I'll be curious how you answer this one. It says, beyond the ethnic cultural diversity, which we talked about earlier, do you find in your work with students there's a greater worldview diversity? And how does that impact conversations with students? So I would just say over the 30 years you've been doing this, and maybe tied into this conversation, is there greater diversity, maybe even within the church and outside of the church, on worldview than in the past?
Yeah, I mean, Sean, you're actually more of an expert in this, so I'll share my impressions, but then I would love for you, if you have a different take. I think, yes, there absolutely is more diverse worldviews, both in general as well as inside the church, more disparate understandings of what it means to follow Jesus. Here's what I would encourage us as we're talking to a kid. I mean, it's listening, and it's speaking the truth in love that I just quoted from Ephesians 4. So, I think that if we're sensing a young person has a very different worldview from us, it's rare that in the first conversation you're going to argue that young person into adopting what you consider a more Christ-centered worldview. First off, it's usually a series of conversations and a longer term relationship. And then secondly, it's a lot of listening and what Jim Rayburn from Young Life called earning the right to be heard. So, in fact, I know a Christian school, I think this is a great assignment to give Christian kids, is to ask them to talk to a non-Christian only
That's
to ask
great.
questions and try to understand.
Great.
Like you're not trying to, because at some point in a regular relationship you will explain, your beliefs and why you believe them. But let's not start there. Let's start with understanding, empathy, and then you'll be closer to them and they'll also be more receptive. But I'm curious, Sean, how would you nuance that, add to it, correct it? I've got great
I,
respect for you in this area.
Oh, that's really kind. Well, I think what you said is exactly right. I think there's always been a range of different beliefs, but what's different today is the access to kids. They're seeing more
Yeah,
beliefs infinitely,
yeah,
but they're also told more than ever, express yourself and tailor things to your own beliefs
it's good.
rather than tailor your life to some external truth that's out there. So
Yeah.
there's a lot more individualized belief than we've seen, at least in my experience. Now, Kara, I've got a tough one for you. I got to be honest with you,
Ooh,
there's not a lot of people that I would ask a question like this without prep. But honestly, I know you can handle it. It's a sensitive question and
okay.
it's
Here we
important.
go.
And so this is from Telly Kaler. She said, my two daughters in their 20s now
Mm,
were deeply affected by my husband leaving me for another woman and since have turned away from God. Advice on how I can handle this as their mom. And as you're thinking, one of the data that I've seen over and over again is that divorce rocks a kid's
yeah,
faith.
yeah.
It just does. So, Telly, you are not alone. I get this question a lot. My encouragement would be not to blame yourself for this. Please
Mm.
give yourself the grace when it comes to this. But any thoughts that jump to your mind, Kara, for someone trying to navigate this with their kids in their 20s, which is different than having a kid still in the home who've turned away from God because of the choice that their dad made?
Oh, uh, Sean, you're absolutely right. I think I would never want Telly to blame herself, feel guilty herself for anything that's happened and how her girls are responding to God. And
Mm,
Telly, I'm actually a daughter of divorce myself. My parents divorced when I
mm,
was 6. And so growing up, it was Mom and Jim and Dad and Helen. And so to say mom and dad together, those words didn't go together for me because it was Mom
mm,
and Jim and Dad and Helen. So I think I have some empathy for what divorce does to a family and what divorce can do to a kid, even though I've actually researched it a little bit. Um, here's, I was going to say this earlier, and this gives me an opportunity to. Um, Sean and I have already talked about the power of other adults, and so you might not be the adult that God uses to draw your daughters back to God. It might be some other adult, and so
mm,
anything you can do to encourage any relationship that they have with a favorite aunt, with a neighbor, with somebody at their church that they just kind of always liked,
mm,
who you're maybe able to invite over for a Sunday meal or whatever it might be with your daughter. So I would say, as well as we can surround our kids who have strayed with Jesus followers, the better. But the second thing I would say is, for us as parents, when our kids are pushing away from us or from our faith, it's easy to take that personally. It's easy to react to that and maybe want to either smother the kid or distance ourselves from the kid. And this is where the work of Lisa Damore, a child psychologist, has been so helpful for me, because what she says we as parents need to do and be is we need to be a wall. We need to be a wall. And let me interpret that a little bit more. I grew up swimming, so I think of a swimming pool. And our kids are going to push away from that wall. They're gonna in developmentally appropriate ways, they're gonna push away from us. They're gonna have other relationships. They're gonna maybe distance themselves from God and the church, as you're experiencing. And when they kick away from us, we are left feeling dented and bruised and hurt. And like I said, we might smother, we might distance ourselves. And what Damore says is This is our opportunity as a parent to just be that consistent emotional presence so that when your child is ready to come back, you haven't moved. You are still there. So, this is where, and we can't always tell that as parents. So, I'd certainly ask friends of yours who know you and know your daughters well, hey, how do you think I'm doing at being a wall? I want to be present so that when my daughters are ready to return back, I'm still there. I'm that safe place. So, those would be a couple of my thoughts. Sean, feel free to add anything to that if
Oh,
you have another thought.
my goodness, I love the idea of playing the end game. I love the idea of encouraging other people to speak in. One thing that jumped to my mind was maybe you've already done this, Telly, but just inviting that conversation, pulling the fruit off softly.
Yeah.
What was it? What was your first memory when Dad did this? How did it make you think about God? How did I respond well? What are things that you wish I had responded differently? Now, I actually just got goosebumps thinking about these because these are real conversations. My wife's parents separated when she was younger, and I've seen her work through some of those issues. But the long game, compassion, modeling for your daughters, I believe you said your two daughters, and just praying before the Lord is all that you can do. And just remember that God's heart is more broken for your daughters than your heart or my heart could ever be. That's humbling when I think about my own kids, that is God's heart for them. So, Kara, you had just a curveball thrown at you. I knew you could do it just with beautiful, I think, biblical advice. Telly, thanks for asking a very honest one.
Thank you, Telly.
Those of you, gosh, there's a bunch of questions I was hoping we got to. We just didn't have time. I always get the best questions on here, Kara, and apologize. We'll try to do a live Q&A soon where I just tackle as many as I can. But there were 3 questions. One was about self-love, how we train young people in a culture that pushes self-love. Number 2 is kind of the worldview question, not only diversity with race, but diversity with beliefs. And the last one with Telly, very practical about with their 20-year-old daughters. Which one would you like to get a signed gift of so the next generation will know whatever criteria intrigues you?
Wow. Okay. I would love to do all of them. I can't not choose Telly though after that final question and how personal that was. So thank you, Telly, for sharing some of your own story with us, and we want to give you one of Josh's great resources to help. So. Sean's great resources to help. Oh, that's funny.
That's awesome.
I'm sure I'm the first person to do that, Sean.
Kara, honestly, I love that on so many levels that you said that and corrected yourself. And I have this on film. So if I ever ask you to speak and you're like, no, I'm going to blow this up and make you feel guilty.
Remember how you mistook me for my dad? Yeah, totally. That'll be great. That'll be great, Sean.
Well, I know you've got a meeting coming up, but let me say very quickly, Telly, if you email to apologetics@biola.edu, apologetics@biola.edu, we will send you a signed copy of So the Next Generation Will Know. The rest of you pick up a copy. It's coming out August 3rd, releasing soon. Kara Powell is a co-author. 3 big questions that change every teenager. Research-based, but very, very practical questions like, I don't know, but tell me more. Some what do you believe now that I don't? What do you not believe that you think I do? These are really practical tools you can put into practice with kids immediately. Last thing I'll say, we'll let you go, is make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other interviews coming up on some fascinating topics. Miracles today, social issues, progressive Christianity. Make sure you hit subscribe. And if you thought about getting a master's degree, we have a full distance program in apologetics now. In fact, I'm teaching a class this fall on equipping and reaching Gen Z. And I didn't tell you this, Kara, I assigned this book, by the way, for my students at Biola. So if you want to explore this more with me and your questions on the side weren't answered, sign up for our apologetics program and study Reaching Gen Z with me this fall. Kara, I'm going to call you a rock star instead of a guru. I think that will be better, but I so appreciate your ministry. Keep it up. And if there's ever anything I can do to help you, let me know.
I feel the same. Thanks so much, Sean. Blessings all.
You got it. See everybody soon.